It's my pleasure now to introduce one of our, another one of our event partners, and we're just joking that, you know, at a city building summit, what do you need? People that actually build cities. And with that now, I'd like to introduce Guy Summers, who is the Senior Vice President of Land Development and Municipal Engineering at WSP Canada, Inc. Please welcome Guy. And I think I said Guy and then I corrected myself.
That's fine. I respond to Guy as well. Where's the clicker?
Stole it.
Mike stole it.
We just met.
Thanks. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to say a few words. Hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. I just wanted to say that WSP is very proud to be part of this city building summit. Mike and Suling contacted me about 3 years ago, and we've been doing it ever since for 3 years. First one, I moderated a session from my bedroom, which was interesting. It worked. But what we want to talk about is WSP is involved in all the different elements we've already talked about today. So revitalizing the downtown or driving growth through connectivity, improving the quality of our life. We're intimately involved in all types of projects of that sort. But I want to tell you that we have a different or unique perspective as a trusted advisor, or in most cases an engineer, working together with our partners. Let's see if this advances. Is there a button I'm not supposed to push?
It was like that when I found it.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Mike. Anyways, and so the items that we're building, the infrastructure we're building, it has to last for decades. It has to be functional, it has to be high performing, and it has to do so in an ever-evolving environment, whether it's whatever type of environment you're talking about, whether it's climate or technology or so on. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the projects that we're working on. You'll maybe recognize a few. Very involved in the renovations at Parliament Hill, mainly center block right now. You can see the cranes. The other big one that is underground in the back of center block is the ESAP, is the district energy system that's being revitalized across the city. And it's going to be mind-boggling what it's going to do in terms of servicing both sides of the river with hot and cold water for building services. And of course, can't talk to the City of Ottawa without mentioning the fact that we're intimately involved in the east, west, and somewhat south extension of the Confederation line. As Sheila mentioned, these are city building projects, very important. Another one from our private sector clients, Jeff Westindy is here from Zibi. We just had the topping party at the 25-story first tower they built out on Zibi, so very exciting last week. We were in attendance there. Stefan from CLC, he was talking about River Ridge. We're very active out in the Rockcliffe Air Base redevelopment. And then, it hasn't been talked about a lot this morning, but it's the educational sector in Ottawa. We have so many universities and colleges, it's impressive. And then the other big one that's just down the canal here is the University of Ottawa Faculty of Health Sciences building, which is just going to be an amazing building, and it's going to be attracting the brightest minds from around the world. We're over 750 professionals in the NCR, which is pretty impressive. 12,000 staff across Canada. Retention. It's vitally important to a company of our size to keep the greatest minds coming to Ottawa, staying in Ottawa, and thriving with us. So it's very important. And of course, that level of growth is only possible thanks to our partners, many of them represented in this room. What I'm particularly excited about is our keynote speaker, because he's going to be talking about the future of our cities. At WSP, we have an initiative, we've trademarked it, it's called Future Ready. And we build everything into it. We understand how our world is changing, and we look for 4 mega trends: climate, resources, society, and technology. So for each one of these things, for respect to climate, we are adapting our buildings and infrastructure to withstand stronger storms, more flooding, rising heat levels that puts more stress on our infrastructure and electrical systems. For example, the capacity of our stormwater infrastructure is the most common vulnerability we find in our climate lens assessments. We see it every year in terms of the flooding. The Ottawa River the flooding is almost an annual event now, and it's drastically affecting all of our friends. From a resource point of view, we look to construct our buildings and projects. We consider decarbonization of the whole project, right? Reduce water consumption for the whole project. Clean energy options and waste reduction, again, throughout the life of the project, not just during the construction period, but what does that mean to heating, cooling, and operating a facility for 10, 20, 50 years. And then from a societal point of view, we need to examine and consider the remote work that we're living with right now, aging population, Indigenous relationships and reconciliation, and our increasing diversity. Canada, and someone mentioned it this morning, Ottawa, is not replacing its own population. Our growth is through immigration. How will Ottawa be part of that, and how can we design our spaces so new citizens feel a sense of belonging here and want to stay here and work here? And lastly, from the mega trends is the technology. It's always changing. 1/3 of our jobs around the world are vulnerable to automation in the next decade. How will this affect our design of institutional and commercial and residential properties? We're still trying to figure that out. Bright minds that we're speaking today and later today, they're going to be informing that conversation. E-commerce continues to increase. How will this affect the city in terms of transportation and delivery of goods? At the same time, how do we leverage new technologies to create smart buildings or smart cities and improve connectivity? WSP is involved in all of that kind of stuff. How do we adapt buildings and infrastructure for a mass shift to electric vehicles or self-driving cars? Sonia spoke of the Area.X, and what are the advancements going to be produced at that facility that are going to affect our transportation? Let's slide away. So, what are we doing? I'm proud that WSP is making the leap from the discussions to the implementations on projects throughout Ottawa. At Parliament Hill, we're creating inclusive and accessible spaces, future-proofing for new technologies, and using the latest seismic technologies to protect the center block far beyond our lifetimes. We're cataloging every 100-year-old steel beam that had to be removed for the renovations and reusing those beams individually throughout the project. The other one that blows my mind is the seismic protection system. The main center block building, when we're done, will be sitting on top of hundreds of air-filled cushions to isolate it from the rock beneath, so if and when earthquakes come, that building will not be damaged. It's impressive. The technology that is being created and advanced through this center block project is mind-boggling. The other big item that I feel is very important to bring up is from a transportation point of view. The rapid bridge replacements that have happened the last 5 to 7 years along the 417 are impressive. They're on the Discovery Channel, right? You can look it up on the Discovery Channel. That technology was brought to Ottawa and to a certain extent to North America by WSP, and we're doing it throughout the core. And if you can imagine the traffic congestion and greenhouse gas emissions that are being avoided by the fact that we do a replacement over the weekend rather than for a year. And lastly, we want to just talk about the ESAP program. This is the Energy Supply and Acquisition, Energy Services Acquisition Program that is renovating or rejuvenating an outdated heating and cooling system that was servicing Ottawa for many decades. And this system, which is primarily downtown, also at Confederation Heights, on both sides of the river, is providing heating and cooling to over 80 federal buildings. The interesting thing is it's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 68% compared to what we're currently using right now. So that's an incredible reduction in greenhouse gas productions. We're very proud of that. Lastly, I just want to talk about some of the tools that WSP has been creating for use by not just our clients, but to the public. You can Google them and you can look them up online. And so what we have is the Zero tool. It's a Spanish term for zero, is zero, Canadian, and the zero is an O is a zero. Anyways, it's for decarbonization. We worked with PSPC to develop this product, and it's used to evaluate the sustainability for federal buildings. So a lot of the federal buildings that are being considered for renovations or various adaptations are going through this tool. When we hear about the future of the changes, today a lot of it has been negative. A lot of it has been negative, but we want to look at those things. We all learned a new word last summer, derecho. Never heard that word before? Don't want to hear it again. But that's climate change, right? Those are the results of climate change. We always hear about the long-term care, the glut of, or we don't have enough availability. We need to find solutions. That's part of the changing society and the aging population. And of course, everyone's complaining about our infrastructure falling apart. Well, we're doing our best. There's so much we can do. But the one takeaway I want to say is being future ready is a positive thing. Adapting to changes and trends, looking at tomorrow and preparing our cities and our world for future generations. Don't have my phone with me, but I just got the ultrasound of my first grandchild. So, big day, big day. Thank you. Gender reveal is tomorrow night. Looking forward to that too. Anyways, WSP is leading the charge towards these and linking the discussions we're having today, the practical solutions in our buildings and infrastructure is just what we're doing right here in Ottawa. I appreciate that. So, to talk about the future in Ottawa, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mike Moffat. Dr. Mike Moffat is a Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the University of Ottawa's Smart Prosperity Institute and an Assistant Professor of Business, Economics, Public Policy Group at Ivey Business School in Western University. Mike's research at SPI focuses on the intersection of regional economic development, building child-friendly, climate-friendly housing and communities, and clean innovation. In 2017, Mike was the Chief Innovation Fellow for the Government of Canada, advising deputy ministers on innovation policy and emerging trends. He was also previously held the titles of Director Interim of the Lawrence National Centre of Policy and Management, Director of Policy for Canada 2020, and Chief Economist for the Moffatt Centre at the University of Toronto. Mike has worked with politicians, policymakers of all political stripes in several countries to craft more effective public policy. Please welcome Mr. Mike Moffat.
So now there you go. You didn't steal on me. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. So I've got some slides. Let's see. Now, can I figure out how to do this? Nope. Nope, it's not working. Oh, there we go. Oh, now it's working too well. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Ottawa and the future of cities, and you heard my sort of job description, and I'm actually a bit of a frustrated meteorologist. So I'm just pretend this is a giant map, and I'm going to point at a bunch of trends and wear a nice pink jacket and try to be the center of attention here. And this is a story about Ottawa, but it's actually a story about some big changes that are happening to the country. So it's not just a story about Ottawa, but it's a story about other places with NHL teams like Edmonton and Vancouver. It's about places with OHL teams like my hometown of London, Ontario. Go Knights, go. Sorry, we're not going to meet your 67s, but I just lost the audience there. But it's also a talk about smaller communities like Tillsonburg and my parents' home community of Whalen Corners, Ontario, population 4. So I know these aren't always easy to see at the back of the room, but this is what house prices look like over the last decade or so. So the blue line is Ottawa, and it goes up a lot, and it kind of comes down a little bit, but it's starting to head back up. Orange is my hometown of London, kind of same thing, goes up a lot, goes down a little bit, and it's starting to head back in the opposite direction. But contrast this with Edmonton. Edmonton is this gray line, and it bounces up and down, but it's relatively flat. And what I'm going to suggest is that this matters, and it should matter to a business community, but it also it illustrates some of these big changes going on in the in Canada and the Canadian economy. That these big changes are not equally distributed across the country, and as well, that how different communities deal with these challenges is different and is having different outcomes. So we can look at house prices. We could look at rents, and it's the same thing here, where if we look at the beginning of the pandemic, the rents in Ottawa were about $1,600 for a new lease on a one-bedroom apartment. It's now close to $2,000. Little London, Ontario has gone from about $1,200 to almost $1,800 in 3 years. I know that the pandemic seems like it's been forever, but it really has only been 3 years. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's the case. But we look here at Edmonton that, oops, wrong button. We look here at Edmonton, we've gone from about $1,050 to just over $1,129. So rents have gone up about $700 in London, Ontario, and about $70 in Edmonton. That is a big, big difference. So what is going on? And what I'll suggest is there are two big changes happening in Canada kind of simultaneously. There's all the other things that we've all known about for a while, you know, demographic change, population aging, climate change, and so on. So all of those things are still occurring. All of those big glacial trends are occurring, but there's two new ones. There's two very important new ones. The first is a population boom, partly from immigration, but also from international students. We are in the midst of an unprecedented boom in international student enrollment, and that is having consequences in Canada, most of them positive, some of them challenges. The second is something I called the big unsort. There was a book about a decade ago called The Big Sort, and the idea behind the big sort is since about 1980 or so, we've seen economic activity move towards, in Canada, we can again call them places with NHL teams. That prior to the pandemic, something like 2/3 of all net new jobs were created in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. We added Edmonton, Calgary, Ottawa, and Winnipeg. Don't forget Winnipeg. That gets us closer to about 85%. But since over the last few years, we're seeing that unwind, and we're actually seeing a reversal of this trend. So it's no longer that we're seeing economic activity move from Tillsonburg to Toronto, but rather starting to move from Toronto to Tillsonburg. And that's going to have some big changes on our economy, and that's going to provide both opportunities and challenges for the Ottawa region. So I'm going to do a comparison, and I always want to make sure I'm doing an apples to apples type comparison. So we're going to look at 3 regions. And I also don't want to be too urban centric. Again, Whaling Corners population 4. So we're going to include some rural areas in here. So 3 areas. The first area is the Ottawa region. So the city of Ottawa and the 5 counties or regions that border in Ontario that border Ottawa. So Prescott Russell, Leeds Grenville, Lanark, Renfrew, and SDG. So that's what we'll define as the Ottawa region. The next region is 3 communities and areas in southwestern Ontario. The first being Kitchener-Waterloo, so Waterloo region. The second being London and the rest of Middlesex County. So got to include Whaling Corners in there. And then the third is the Niagara region. So St. Catharines, Fort Erie, so on. So that'll be the second region we look at. The third region will be Edmonton. And it won't just include the city of Edmonton, but I'll include all the sort of rural areas around it. So 3 regions that we're going to compare to illustrate what the heck is going on in Canada. And if we look at the population as of July 1st, 2015, so as of Canada Day 2015, we see they're all basically the same. They're all basically about 1.4 million people. 1.4 million people live in Ottawa. 1.4 million people live in KW, London, and Niagara. And just under 1.4 million live in the Edmonton region. So, you know, as far as population goes, it's an apples to apples comparison. But since then, if we look at overall population growth, we see a big divergence of trends. That, you know, Ottawa, like the rest of Canada, has seen their population growth accelerate. So Ottawa's here is in blue. And if we look at 2022 over here, so this little blue area here. But overall, it's lagging behind. We're seeing a big population surge in southwestern Ontario. Southwestern Ontario's population is growing about twice the rate of the Ottawa region. Edmonton, not quite as fast as southwestern Ontario, but it's also seeing an increase as well. That prior to about, basically until about 18 months ago, Ottawa and Edmonton were growing at basically the same rate. Now Ottawa is growing, or now Edmonton is growing significantly faster. So what's going on, and what does that tell us about where our regional economies are going? So next slide, please. So there's three basic ways that the population of a place can grow in the 21st century. Historically, it's been because births outpace deaths. That largely doesn't happen anymore. In most communities, births and deaths roughly net out. Some places have more births than deaths, some other way around. But generally speaking, population growth from what they call natural causes is near zero. So there's basically three ways a community can grow their population. The first is through immigration. So this is permanent residency, people applying for and getting permanent residency who were born and raised in another country. That's the first way. The second way is what we call non-permanent residents. So it's kind of like immigration, but they're here on some form of time expiring visa. So that can be an international student, that could be asylum seeker, refugee from Ukraine, and so on. It's mostly international students, that's the sort of bulk of them. And I often call them, instead of non-permanent residents, I think we should think of them often as pre-permanent residents. That if we can create a way to create a community in which they want to live, they'll probably stay. And the data bears this out, but Statistics Canada calls them non-permanent residents, and I don't like to pick fights with the federal government, so if that's what they want to call this cohort, I'm happy to oblige. The third way a community can grow is through basically domestic migration. So people from Tillsonburg moving to Toronto, or people from Toronto moving to Tillsonburg. And that could be within province or across provinces. So this is basically the three ways that populations can grow. So if we look at these three specific ways and then go back to our three communities, we'll see very, very different growth patterns. So the first is immigration. And this is one where Ottawa is doing very, very well. We are, in sheer sort of numbers, we're seeing immigration rates go up. So we're seeing this coupling that across communities in Ontario, we are seeing increased immigration, partly because immigration targets are going up, but partly because that proportion that are settling in the GTA is starting to decline. And again, it's a slow glacial thing where every year or two it declines by a percentage point, or if you want to look at it the other way, that the rest of Ontario increases by a percentage point. So overall, Ottawa and the Ottawa region we're doing a pretty good job of attracting newcomers, particularly newcomers on a permanent residency. So that's a good news story. That the majority still settle in Toronto and Peel region, but the proportion's falling, that other cities are becoming more attractive. So the question for Ottawa is, the opportunity here for Ottawa is, we know that our population is aging. We know that talent from all over the world wants to come to Canada, wants to come to Ontario. Can we create communities in which they want to live? Because there's a lot of competition. And I can tell you, I talked to the mayor of London. I talked to the mayor of Guelph. They want to attract these new residents to their community. So what can we do in Ottawa to make sure that some of the most talented people in the world who really want to be in Ontario, that they come to Eastern Ontario, not Southwestern Ontario? So then we look at net non-permanent residents. And not surprisingly, as I told you, most of them are international students. Most of them are international students, so places that are big sort of college towns are seeing this population rise and rise significantly. So, why is KW and London, this so high? Well, it's because of our colleges and universities in Southwestern Ontario. Waterloo, Laurier, Western, and actually a lot of the activity is actually more coming on the college side. So college enrollments on the international side are actually rising faster than the university side. So it's not so much Western, it's actually Fanshawe where you're seeing this. So what we're seeing communities do is work with their colleges and universities to, at the beginning end, at the front end, go, we know that there's a lot of talented people from all over the world who want to come here, study, stay up to 3 years under the postgraduate work permit program, and then apply for permanent residency. So what we're seeing is colleges and universities work with chambers of commerce, work with regional trade boards to go, okay, how can we start to identify labor market needs? And how can we integrate, integrate that enrollment there? So can we have, if we know we have a shortage of people in the skilled trades, can we work with our colleges and universities to increase international student enrollments in those programs, recruit from those programs, and build that up? We're seeing communities, again, particularly in southwestern Ontario, really take advantage of this. Really sort of see this as a way as an attraction and retention strategy. So instead of thinking about how do we attract and retain the young graduates, start 5 years earlier. Think, how can we attract and retain the 17 and 18-year-olds to come to our colleges, to come to our universities, to open up programs that meet current and future projected labor market needs, and start early. And start early, because if you don't, those students are going to go to London. They're going to go to St. Catharines. They're not going to come here. And this will be a real missed opportunity. So international student is driving a lot of population growth, particularly in mid-sized cities. So today's international student is tomorrow's net permanent resident. Today's college student is tomorrow's computer programmer or welder or chef or whatever area where we think we're having labor market challenges. But the number one challenge, the number one thing that's actually preventing enrollments from going up higher and preventing people from international students from taking advantage of the opportunities in places like Ottawa is rents. Rents in southwestern Ontario college and university towns are up 20% year over year. And it's largely due to just enrollments going up and a housing shortage. So we need to start thinking about housing supply, particularly at entry-level apartments, as an economic development strategy, right? Because if we can get people here at 17 and 18, give them a decent quality of life, they will stay after graduation, and we can fill a lot of labor market needs. So we need to be thinking about how can we make Ottawa an attractive place for international students, a place that they can afford. Because I got to tell you, $1,850 or whatever it is for a one-bedroom apartment is a real challenge for a lot of international students, let alone domestic students. And I've got two kids who eventually will be with those domestic students, and I would certainly like to see rents go down in college and university towns. So then finally, we can look at people moving from one community to another within Canada. And we can break this down into people moving within province. So let's look at people who move from one community in Ontario to another community. Overall, we're seeing an increase in the Ottawa region. Not so much the city of Ottawa, as I'm sure Jason will tell you, but a lot of it is Carleton Place and Perth and a lot of sort of communities, a lot of communities outside of the city. Those obviously many are moving to the city as well. But we're also seeing big increases in KW, London, Niagara. And trust me, we in London, we do not consider ourselves part of the GTA. It's a 2-hour drive. So this is not, this is not a traditional pattern of people moving from Toronto, the old city of Toronto to Etobicoke. These are communities that are significant distance from Toronto. So we go, okay, well, what communities are attracting the most residents? And I'll read through these. I know they're not the easiest to see. So what communities are attracting the most residents from within province? Well, some of them are easy to understand. So we look at Durham region, which is the second one here. That's the Oshawa area. We're like, okay, well that kind of makes sense. Families moving out of the city of Toronto, doing something called drive until you qualify, where somebody wants to buy a home, they can't afford Toronto. So they hop in the car and drive as far as they need to go in order to qualify for a mortgage. Not surprisingly, a lot of them are ending up in Oshawa because it's pretty much the closest place that still has some level of attainability. So you have Oshawa, you have Simcoe, which is Barrie, You have the Niagara region that I mentioned. But then you're getting some places that are pretty far away from Toronto, like Middlesex, London. You know, that's 200 kilometers, maybe 185 if you're moving to Dorchester, but you know, it's pretty far away. But the one that really I find particularly fascinating is Oxford, Ontario. And I know many of you probably don't know a whole lot about Oxford County, but there's probably two communities you've heard of. The first one is Woodstock, and the second one is Tillsonburg. And the thing you know, I find here in Ottawa is if I mention Tillsonburg, the only thing that comes up is a Stompin' Tom song, right? And we have this sort of mind's eye picture of Tillsonburg in our minds. You know, you listen to the Stompin' Tom song and it's all about hard work and rural poverty and so on. I suggest if you ever get a chance, you should go. If you're ever in southwestern Ontario, just drive through Tillsonburg. And I'm not, you know, I'm not part of the tourism board there. They're not paying me any retainers. You will find it surprising. You know, tobacco fields have been replaced with soccer fields. They can't find enough people to run the daycares. This was a place that 10 years ago was depopulating. You know, the average age was old. You know, I don't want to. I'm going to be careful of the analogies I do, but it was old. It was a very great community. Now you go there, it's all 3- and 4-year-olds. It's all young families from Toronto moving in. It's all young families from Toronto moving in. It's one of the most dynamic places, one of the fastest growing places in the country, let alone the province. And we all think of it as a place of, you know, agricultural poverty and hard work. Times are changing. You know, the southwestern Ontario of my youth is not the southwestern Ontario of 2023. Okay, and then we can look at the opposite side. If people are moving within a province, where are they coming from? And I have these in rank order. The blue is 2015, 2016, and the orange is 21, 22, which is the latest year we have data. And basically, if you're moving out of your city within a province on net and moving somewhere in the province, you're basically coming from one of 4 places. Toronto, Montreal, and this is people in Montreal moving to other parts of Quebec, Peel region, and Greater Vancouver. So if you look at, you know, why, you know, who's coming and settling in the Ottawa region, in Tillsonburg, or have you, they're really coming from 2 places, City of Toronto and Peel region. And those just happen to also be the 2 places with the least housing attainability and affordability, particularly for young families. We can also look at their ages. So I can map out here the ages, the average age, or the number of people by age who are leaving the City of Toronto and Peel region. And there's 2 big spikes. First spike is young kids. And the second spike is people between about the ages of 28 and 35. You do see some, you know, late career movers, people who are sort of cashing out of their, they bought a place in Cabbagetown like 40 years ago for next to nothing, and then they're moving to Leamington or someplace with an extra $2 million in their pocket. That happens, but it's actually a smaller proportion than you might think. If you look at who leaves Toronto, it's 30-year-olds and 30-month-year-olds. And it's not the 30-month-year-olds who are calling the shot. Well, maybe it is kind of the 30-month-year-olds. I'm a dad. And again, you can imagine the scenario here, that you've got a lot of young people living in a condo in Toronto, baby comes along or baby's on the way, they just said, this ain't gonna work. So they're looking for communities to which to raise kids. So there's this exodus out of city, not just the City of Toronto, but that's the biggest one. But Peel, some York is starting to lose some people as well. The leavers are disproportionately young families, right? They're couples in their 30s, and their kids not even in school yet. So the thing is, creating child-friendly communities with attainable housing, safe streets, things like that, that should be part of any labor attraction and economic development strategy. If you want to attract talented young people, don't focus on them, focus on their kids. Not in a creepy way, but focus on their kids. That's how you get talent here. That's what dictates, and we have survey data on this. The number one reason that a 30-year-old moves is because they want larger, more affordable housing to which to raise children. that is the biggest driver of migration in the country. We need to focus on kids. And then finally, if we look at people switching provinces, this is where things have changed and changed really recently. That before the pandemic, people were moving to the Ottawa region from other provinces. And a lot of that was honestly people moving from the other side of the river, moving here. But you'll notice over the last year or so, there's been this big change where Ontario, both the Ottawa region and southwestern Ontario, we're losing people to other provinces where we used to gain it. And on the flip side, Edmonton, which had actually been losing people to other provinces, is now gaining it. And this is just a big change that's happened in about the last 18 months or so. And it's continuing on. If I show you more recent data, it's just growing, growing, growing. So this is a very recent change that I wouldn't have predicted 5 years ago. So we can do the same exercises. Where are they going to? And they're going to 4 places. If a Canadian is changing provinces, they're basically going to 4 places that they didn't used to go to. It's Calgary, Halifax, Edmonton, and Moncton. I never thought it'd be Moncton, but it's Moncton, and it's actually all through Atlantic Canada. It's all through Atlantic Canada, but those are the big 4. Those are the big 4 places that are attracting people from other parts of Canada. Calgary, Edmonton, Halifax, and Moncton. Those are the big 4. The places losing people are places you would expect. Toronto, Peel, Montreal, Simcoe, and I hate to tell you, the city of Ottawa are losing people. Well, what the heck is going on? It's actually not that hard to figure out. And we can figure it out by looking at who's leaving. It's basically people, mostly people, who graduate college and university and are taking their first job. It's mostly college and university people who are taking their first job and going, I can live wherever I want now. I can, this is the one chance I'm going to have to take a job in a job market that's, unemployment rate is near 50 years low. I can be a little bit picky. And then furthermore, many of those jobs I can work from home. So not only, am I mobile in the sense that, I can go work for some company in Moncton, but now I can go work for some company in Mississauga and live in Moncton. So we see this clear in the data, absolutely clear in the data, that our college and university graduates, as soon as they get out of school, the first thing they figure out is, where do I want to spend the next 10 years? And they're choosing Calgary, Edmonton, Halifax, and Moncton. And as far as Ottawa goes, they're unfortunately moving in the other direction. And this is part of the big unsort. This is part of people moving away from larger cities like your Torontos and Ottawas to these sort of mid-sized centers. And this is unusual, right? That unusual, like if I had shown you this data 10 years ago, it would have shown the opposite. It definitely would have showed people leaving Moncton and moving to Ottawa. Now it's the other direction. People are leaving Ottawa and moving to Moncton. Well, why are they doing that? It's not hard to figure out. It's housing prices. It's housing prices, right? If I'm making, it's an entry-level job, I'm making $40,000, $50,000 a year. There's a big difference between paying $2,000 a month in rent and paying $1,200 a month in rent. That is a massive, massive difference. So it is crucial that we build not just enough homes for young families, but enough places for people to live who are 5, 10 years away from having their first kid. And for all of you who are in business or trying to attract and retain young talent, because I always get the question, this sort of self-centered question, like, well, if you already own a home, like, why do I care if housing is expensive? Here's why everybody in this room should care. Anybody who writes a paycheck at the end of the month and is trying to attract and retain talent. We should think of home prices as a payroll tax. Home prices for young people are essentially payroll tax that aren't being paid so much by them, but they're being paid by the employer. Because if you want to attract and retain talent, you have to say, okay, well, If I want to prevent people from moving to Edmonton, I'm going to have to pay 15 to 20% higher wages for them to stay, or else they're going to go, because their disposable income will be higher if they move to Edmonton, Calgary, Halifax, or Moncton. So if I want to compete with those cities, and if we want to compete with those cities as a region, we need to get our rent prices down. Because ultimately those rent prices are going to be paid by employers. We're going to have to raise wages to compensate young people for those higher home prices. So it affects all of us. It's not just affecting the 25-year-old. It's affecting the people who want to employ the 25-year-old. It is, at the end of the day, a payroll tax. And we have to understand, why in part is Edmonton doing so well at attracting newcomers? It's not an accident. They saw what was happening. This is an ad on the TTC, and they're now running these ads on radio stations all across the province. Say, what is the average price of a detached home? Toronto, $1.4 million. Edmonton, $490,000. Alberta is calling.ca. So don't think that the cities that we're competing with aren't noticing and aren't going to take advantage of that. So I think it's incumbent in all of us on this room to think about, how can we be this friendly competition? How can we compete with the Edmontons? I believe we can. I believe we have a lot to offer here. I moved here from London, Ontario in 2017, despite my London Knights fandom. We chose to raise a family here. I think we made the right choice, and I'd love to see the next generation be able to make that choice. So happy to answer any questions. I think, do we have time for Q&A? We do? Okay. We'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Oh, we got.
Merci. Thank you. Very good intervention on your part. We keep talking about lowering the rent.
Yeah.
But in order to have a sustained construction of new buildings and new rentals, builders need to take into account the cost of construction.
Yep.
So how can you lower the rent if you're not able to lower the cost of construction?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think we'll absolutely have to do that. So we look at the tax side. So every actor in the system is going to have to play their role. So when we're looking at the municipal side, we have to look at taxes and development charges and things like that. From the builder side, we need to look at productivity. How can we build more? How can we build more with fewer inputs, whether that be labor inputs, material inputs, and so on? So we have to be more efficient, more productive. I believe that our trades unions and our colleges in particular play a huge role. We are in this unfortunate cycle, which I'm sure Jason and the home builders can talk about, is that we have a shortage of housing here in Ontario. It's driving up housing prices and is causing electricians and roofers and plumbers to move to Edmonton, Calgary, Moncton, and Halifax. So our housing shortage is making it difficult to retain and attract the employees we need to address that housing shortage. That is one hell of a paradox, but I think it's something that we need to address. So every actor in the system needs to play a role. And it ultimately comes, we treat it often as an economics problem, and I'm an economist, but after a while, it just becomes a simple math problem, right? That you need to build more homes to have more places for families to live, right? Like vacancies have been driven down as low as they can possibly go. So it's just a matter of how do we get units up, and we're absolutely going to have to be more efficient about it. Simply because you're going to run into material bottlenecks, cost bottlenecks, labor bottlenecks pretty quickly. So we're going to have to get a little bit creative and figure out how to do this. But it's a challenge worth doing because the alternatives are worse. The alternatives are worse. So I've answered every question on my presentation. That's always a good sign. That's always a good sign. Oh, got one over here.
Thanks very much. My name is Ross Meredith, and I work in hospitality here in Ottawa. I think you touched on it, but I just want to expand on it a little bit because I lived in Alberta for a while, so I think I have some direct knowledge. When you look at, I think one of the things you touched on was a housing shortage. I think it's also a massive taxation difference when you talk about Alberta. So income tax, 5 points, HST, 0. And property taxes at least 40% less on the same home. So you put that combination together, and you add that to half a price of house, and we're going to be up against a competitive balance shift that is difficult. So yeah. I think that both at the city and the provincial level, I think we need to remind those decision makers that tax inputs to Ottawa and to Ontario residents also will have a negative draw against where people choose to live, both within Canada and perhaps outside Canada. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. And I absolutely agree that that's how we need to look at it, that cities and communities provide a bundle of goods and a bundle of costs, and we need to figure out how to best maximize the benefits and minimize the costs as much as possible. But you'll note that, again, until recently, we were actually we weren't losing that many people to Edmonton. But what's happened is the differential between home prices, if we go back to that original graph I showed you, 10 or 15 years ago, a home price in Ottawa and a home price in Edmonton was basically a wash. And we didn't see this big migration between the two cities and between the two provinces. Saw a little bit when oil prices were high, people moving to Fort Mac, but that's a little bit different. But now that home prices and rents are about 2x in Ottawa what they are in Edmonton, that has really affected our competitiveness and really affected our ability to attract and retain labor.
Thank you. Hugh Gorman from Colony Bridgeport. I'm just curious about policy frameworks. So the cities that are attracting Halifax, Western Canada, is there things happening in those regions from a policy framework perspective that are stimulating, aside from house pricing, and I understand that, whether you're seeing policy incentives that are helping with that equation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll separate them out between the two Atlantic Canada ones and the two Alberta ones. So Halifax and Moncton, it was largely just a story of house prices and rents that, now they're the fastest growing sort of house prices and rents in the country, just in percentage terms. So they're having to scramble to keep up. Right, and there's a bit of a sort of serendipity that it just became sort of a meme during the pandemic of people moving out there and enjoying it, and that sort of attracted more people, and it's kind of had a snowball effect. So they're a little bit earlier in the policy life cycle where they're now having to deal with these challenges of growth. I think of places like Edmonton in particular. There, it's partly serendipity, but a lot of it is policy decisions that they made, that they tend to allow more building by right, particularly downtown, of mid-sized apartments. They've largely abolished parking minimums, which allows for more units to be put in a particular space that is a better focus on land use. So, yes, there's been some sprawl as well, but it's this sort of combination of both building up in a missing middle way, as well as building out, coupled with investments in bike paths and parks and other sort of quality of life areas. So I think it is a community that we can, if I look at, who's doing really interesting things on the municipal side, I think Edmonton has been over the last 10 to 15 years. So I don't think their relative, slow increase in house prices, I don't think that's entirely an accident. I think they've had some very good policy decisions at the municipal level over the last decade that have served them well. Oh, got another one over here.
Hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Madin Hadmasu. I'm with BGC Ottawa, formerly known as Boys and Girls Clubs of Ottawa. You said something that was music to my ears, and maybe a few others, you thought, or a few other folks that are in the room, where you talked about focusing on the children when we're trying to attract. So can you elaborate a little bit more about what does that look like, and maybe give some examples of spaces outside Ottawa that have done that in a way that does translate into attracting more folks into their cities?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a lot of, again, Edmonton's a prime example of having bike paths and parks and things like that. In my hometown of London, we've really tried to. There's been a push to better integrate school planning with municipal planning. That more came out of a sort of a failure. And one of the issues that we were having in London, attracting and retaining families, was the fact that they would move to London and the schools in the new neighborhoods would have more portables than they would have indoor classrooms. So the London area has been trying to address that. So it's just basically having new developments in neighborhoods where the schools are already there, already built. That the kids are getting the best educational experience possible, that you have those child-friendly amenities of parks, soccer fields, baseball fields, those kinds of things. So it's really just those quality of life issues that I think play a big role. Another one as well is, I know communities have worked with YMCAs and YWCAs to have make childcare more available, more after-school programs, things like that. And I think a lot of it as well is not just having these things, but including them as part of your economic development strategy. Is actually talking about the good things that are already happening, that new families might not be aware of, but as well also mentioning that to companies who are thinking of moving to a location, saying, we know we live in an era of retirements and relatively low unemployment rates. Here are the things that we are doing in our community to attract and retain young families, because we know those are the workers that we're going to need over the next 30 years or so. So it's having the amenities, working with school boards to make sure that when someone is moving in, that schools aren't overcrowded. But it's also just telling those stories and selling that as part of your economic development package, and not just talking about the sort of nuts and bolts things like guys like me normally teach in business school.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there's this one over here. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Jeff Parks with the Taggart Group. I was just wondering, one of the unique features of our city is that we're on the border of Quebec. Mm-hmm. We've got this great sister city called Gatineau right next door. And first of all, I was wondering, did you look at the Ottawa, when your statistics looked at Ottawa, was it including Gatineau or not?
Yeah, so it wasn't in this presentation, but we've seen over the last few years that particularly during the pandemic, that migration change, where it used to be Gatineau residents on net would be moving to Ottawa, and that seemed to flip during the pandemic, and a lot of that is due to again, due to differences in cost of living and more space and things like that. Particularly during the pandemic, you had a lot of people leave downtown Ottawa and move a little bit further afield when they weren't having to go to work every single day. So that so that wasn't in the presentation, but absolutely that's something that we consider liberation is a little bit different than, say, a London, Ontario, which is surrounded by lakes and not provinces.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, as a city building kind of idea, that Ottawa should probably be partnering with its sister city, right?
Yep.
And thinking globally, because, they have many of the same attributes that we have over here on this side, but they're lucky in some senses from a housing perspective that their rents tend to be 20 or 30% cheaper. I don't have the statistics in front of me.
No, I think you nailed it, actually. I think that's bang on.
We should be taking advantage of that. And I don't know how, I did my undergraduate thesis on growth in the National Capital Region, right? And we never, unfortunately, the conversation doesn't really come up very often that we do have meetings and we try and collaborate, but not generally from a housing perspective. We don't really think that large. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think we should. And again, I keep bringing the conversation back to southwestern Ontario because it's the one geography I know pretty well. We've been trying to do that down there, where we have a new Volkswagen EV battery plant going into St. Thomas, where the city of St. Thomas and London and some of the surrounding communities are having to figure out, okay, well, what does this mean for housing needs? What does this mean for transit when to get people to and from the factory? So absolutely, we should be looking at these issues in a regional lens and working with the communities around us, whether, again, they be on the Quebec side of the border or some of the smaller communities near Ottawa, because people make that decision. It's not so much which city am I going to move to, but which sort of region am I going to. So.
Can we say thank you to Mike?
Thank you. Thank you.
Mike, I just, oh yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's very much in line with a lot of what we've already heard today on our agenda about how we have to think about the future growth of our city, how maybe if housing is not the silver bullet, it's the closest thing to it, and how we have to start planning for hosting families for the workforce of the future. And I loved how you positioned housing as a payroll tax, and really demonstrates why every one of us needs to be concerned about the future of our housing and what we can do to contribute to that. And particularly how we have to work with every level of government in order to achieve it. So we're very grateful that you chose to move to the Ottawa region and raise your children here. If you ever think of leaving, just let us know and we'll find a way to make you stay. But we really do appreciate your insights and the work that you're doing. I know you're doing a lot of work across the country for cities. So we're happy to have you right here in Ottawa, and we hope to have you back again. Thank you very much.